So today I would like to talk to you about a grammar structure called the conditional. A conditional sentence is a sentence that uses the subordinating conjunction if. For example, if you skip breakfast, you will feel hungry. Now, why is this type of sentence called the conditional? Pause this video and think about it for a moment. The answer is that the two clauses in this sentence describe a condition and a result. If you skip breakfast, that's the condition. You will feel hungry. That's the result. Now, the important thing to understand is that English has three kinds of conditional sentences, and they all involve the subordinating conjunction if. The first conditional expresses things that everybody agrees are true. For example, if you touch fire, you will burn your hand. Now let's take a look at this sentence. If you touch fire, that's the condition clause. You will burn your hand, that's the result clause. Now let's analyze the grammar of this sentence. First, of course, we have an if. Then we have the condition clause after the if, you touch fire. Now this is written in the present simple tense. Next, we have a comma followed by the result clause. And this is where it gets kind of interesting. Okay, so here's our result clause, you will burn your hand. Let's analyze the grammar of this second clause. First, we have the subject. In this particular case, the subject is you, but it could be any pronoun or noun as the subject. Now after the subject, we have will. Will is a special kind of verb called a modal verb. In fact, you can write first conditional sentences with other modal verbs besides will. You could use may, such as you may burn your hand, or can, you can burn your hand, or shall burn your hand, or might burn your hand, or could burn your hand, depending on your sort of level of confidence in the outcome. Since I'm running out of space, I'm going to slide everything over to the left here. So after the subject comes the modal verb. Now there's a number of modal verbs in English, but if you're using the first conditional, there are some modal verbs that you can use and some that you cannot use. So will, may, can, could, might, shall, should, and could, all of these can serve as modal verbs in a first conditional sentence. But it's important to know that would cannot be used in the first conditional. Now, after the modal verb, we have the main verb. In this case, it's burn. The main verb is in the bare form because that's the rule. Any verb that follows a modal verb is always going to be in the bare form. So, this is the structure of a sentence if you want to write a first conditional sentence. Pay close attention to this because it will be important later. English, however, has two other kinds of conditional statements or conditional sentences, and I want you to now pay very close attention to the differences in grammar. So let me scroll down here and make a little bit more room. All right, and we'll begin to talk about the second conditional. So let me slide down, make a little bit more room here. All right, and we'll begin to talk now about the second conditional. If I had $1 million, I would buy you a house. Now let me clean this up so we can compare the two more closely. Okay, let's think about this second sentence. The first sentence, if you touch fire, you will burn your hand, is a factual statement of truth. If this, then definitely this. But the second statement is not as true. For one thing, I don't have $1,000,000, unfortunately. But it might become true. Maybe I could win the lottery. This second kind of conditional statement is a little bit different from the first. Where the first described facts, the second conditional is used for conjecture or hypotheses. Now, as before, this sentence has a condition clause, if I had $1,000,000, and a result clause, I would buy you a house. Now let's look at the grammar of these two clauses. First, as before, we have an if, then the condition clause. But now the condition clause is not written in the present simple tense, it's written in the past simple tense. Next, we have a comma and the result clause. Now, in the result clause, as before, first we have a subject. In this case, the subject is I. And then we have a modal verb. But in this case, the second conditional, the modal verbs that you can use are different. You can only use the modal verbs would, could, should, or might. And then, as before, you have the main verb, in this case it's buy, in the bare form. So let's take a moment and compare the two conditionals. In the first conditional, the condition clause, if you touch fire, is written in the present simple tense. But in the second conditional, the condition clause, if I had $1,000,000, is written in the past simple tense. Also, the result clauses in the first and second conditional allow you to use different modal verbs. In the first conditional, you can use will, may, can, shall, might, could, should, but in the second conditional, you can only use would, could, should, or might. For instance, would can only be used in the second conditional, and will, may, can, shall cannot be used in the second conditional. So this is the main point. The grammar of a conditional statement changes depending on whether the author considers it a factual or hypothetical statement. But it doesn't stop there. English has one more type of conditional statement, the third conditional. But to better understand it, first I want to give you a brief history lesson. This is Sun Yat-sen. He was the founder of the Chinese Republic in 1911, and he was so respected that everyone followed him. But he died from liver cancer in 1925 at the young age of 58. After he died, his nationalist and communist supporters started fighting each other in 1927, which began the Chinese Civil War. But what if history had happened differently? What if Sun Yat-sen had not died at the age of 58? What if he had lived another 30 years? Maybe he would have held his revolutionary party together and the Chinese Civil War would never have happened. This kind of thinking is called counterfactual thinking. But of course, this kind of thinking is very human, especially when we regret something. Who in their life hasn't thought back and wondered if they could have changed the past or done something in a different way? Statements like, if I had known, if we had been there, if she had only listened to me, if I had told her I loved her. These all sound like the beginnings of regrets, the beginnings of people wondering what would happen if the past could have been different. They are all also examples of the third conditional. So here is my example of a counterfactual conditional statement. If Sun Yat-sen had lived, China would have avoided civil war. If Sun Yat-sen had lived, that's the condition clause, China would have avoided civil war. That's the result clause. Now, let's look at the grammar structure of this third conditional sentence. I'll erase this I'll slide down a little bit to give us a bit more room. First, we have an if, and then the conditional clause is written in the past perfect tense. Sun Yat-sen had lived. Then, after that, a comma, and we have the subject of the result clause. In this particular case, it's China. Then we have the modal verb. In this case, we could either have could, would, should, or might. Then we have the bare form of have. Let me slide things over a bit to give us a bit more room. And then we have the main verb, but this time the main verb avoided is in the past participle form. So now I'm going to take a step back and get it so that we can compare the grammar of all three kinds of conditional clauses, conditional sentences. So if we take a step back, we can see that each type of conditional statement has a very different grammar structure. In the first conditional, the condition clause is written in the present simple tense. You touch fire. That's present simple. In the second conditional, the condition clause is written in the past simple tense. I had $1 million. Past simple. And in the third conditional, the condition clause is written in the past perfect tense. If Sun Yat-sen had lived longer. That's past perfect. So the first difference is that the condition clauses for these three types are all in different tenses. The next difference is that the three types of conditionals can use different types of modal verbs. The first conditional can use will, may, can, shall, might, should, could, but the second and third conditionals can only use would, could, should, might. Also, in the second conditional, the main verb is in the bare form, but the third conditional can have a helper verb have in the bare form, and then the main verb in the past participle. So my question is, why does English make this grammatical distinction? And I think the answer has to do with degrees of reality. The first conditional is the most real. It describes facts. If you touch fire, you will burn your hand. The second conditional is less real. It's hypothetical. It describes things that are not true, I had $1 million, but could become true. I would buy you a house if I had $1 million. Finally, the third conditional describes changing the past, and that is the most impossible. I might one day get $1 million, but I will never be able to go back and change the past. So each conditional, from the first to the second to the third, takes us, I think, farther away from reality. And English indicates that through the grammar structure. So by examining the grammar of a conditional statement, you can tell how realistically the author views the chances of a particular condition and result. Study these three types of conditionals, and next time you read or see a conditional statement, examine which type is being used. This will tell you whether the author views the condition as a fact of the world, or as a hypothetical or imaginary situation, or if the author is describing a counterfactual, is describing changing the past. Finally, one more point. When you are using the second conditional, there is a special grammar rule which comes into play called the subjunctive. It's not a very common rule, and it is a little bit complicated, but if you really want to master English, it's important to learn about. However, since it's so complicated, and since this has already been a fairly long video, we will save that discussion for the next video. Thank you very much.